Okay, welcome back to another segment on the biology of Kundalini. I think this is like our 21st part, so we are chunking this thing away. I hope it's helping you understand what's going on in your biology as you are awakening. We are in the section called Down is Up. This is in part 3 of the book, and we're on page 86 if you're following along. So Kundalini does not necessarily move up the body, for it is all happening in the brain and felt in the body as a consequence. The brain and body are one. The sensations and chemistry occurring in the body is also reflected in the brain and vice versa. One of the physical symptoms of Kundalini, the double helix of energy up the spine, has been stigmatized in myth as the serpent symbol. It is unfortunate, for this gets mixed up with the symbol of the biblical serpent, and then Kundalini is relegated to the mere physical realm. In an ignorant and fearful culture, Kundalini is then something that is superstitiously desacralized, made not sacred. However, Kundalini is, in capital letters, I-S, the sacred energy itself that expands and deepens everything physical, emotional, mental, psychic, and spiritual. It cannot be relegated to any one domain because it inhabits all domains. Kundalini is no different than spirit. The way Eastern language treats Kundalini adds to the general mystification of the process. Sanskrit is a metaphorical, pre-scientific language that often confuses more than it illuminates, although I find it very illuminating. She says there are no snakes in Kundalini, no coiled thing. There's no such thing as nadis. The energy fields are just that, fields, not discrete lines of force. The Ida and Pingala can be seen as the left and right sympathetic trunks that run either side of the spine. Sometimes a special event can occur where around the spine and up the sympathetic trunks, sometimes a special event can occur where energy can be felt to spiral around in a double helix from ganglion to ganglion around the spine and up the sympathetic trunks, giving the sensation of two entwined coiled snakes. She says we no longer need to use mythic snake metaphors or imagine mysterious forces for which there is no scientific correlate. Many earnest people get rather knotted up about Kundalini and are apt to insist that spiritual practice is the be-all and end-all of spirituality, without considering the role of spirit in the process. It's spirit that spiritualizes, after all. Spirit shows us the way from inside out at such speed. It's all one can do to try and get out of the way in order to cope, adapt, and live up to the demands of the alchemy. Don't believe anyone that tells you awakening is a linear path, all laid out with pretty chakra lights to lead the way. Follow the colors and you will get to heaven, Shambhala, or enlightenment. No, reality is far different from this. Kundalini flows up in order to flow down, and down in order to flow up. One way of looking at metamorphosis is the dance of two intertwined, opposing forces of charges, poles, sexes, and hemispheres. At the central nervous system level, the yang is the sympathetic on switch. The yin force is the parasympathetic off switch. Kundalini, we could say, is the rhythmic dance of these two forces taking us on a hyperbolic tango up and down. If we don't know how to flow with this polar dance, we resist both up and down, resulting in the burnout of both sides of the nervous system, and we succumb to listlessness, depression, and meaninglessness. She says she doesn't follow the chakra system except in abstract theory as a symbolic metaphysical map of the phylogenic and ontogenic development of consciousness. And I kind of agree with that, though I have used them. They're very helpful, symbolic imagery, so I do use them. At some point, though, they all dissolve. She continues, to open up more of the higher areas, the lower areas are simultaneously opened. In order to open the lower areas, the higher areas are simultaneously opened. Yes. As we evolve, the belly, solar plexus, and pelvis become increasingly relaxed, more sensate, and therefore more immune to blind reactivity. We can then digest phenomena in the hyperrelation of our inner core, and in this way we get off the wheel of samsara, or blind adherence to conditioned responses. Samsara literally means wandering on, or without conscious witness, while enlightenment, or moksha, is liberation from samsara. The liberating fires of Kundalini in the belly frees us from our simian nature and culture. She took that out of Hara, the Vital Center of Man by Carl Fried Graf Durkheim. She continues, Kundalini follows its own course through the body that is specific to each person, but it is definitely not a linear path of just up the body, which is really good to remember. It is oscillating, does go up and down, excuse me. She says, it's not linear going up except during conjunction experiences when enormous energy pours upward through the body with the force of a concord. She says, then, since my awakening, I'm adverse to saying that the lower plexuses or chakras open prior to the higher. In my experience, they all open simultaneous to various degrees. I agree. And since the linear body is all holographically represented in the brain, its activity in the brain that is expressed at various regions of the body, it is hard to say what is top and what is tail. Thus, Kundalini moving upwards is sort of a misnomer. It doesn't start out at the base of the spine and eventually reach the brain. It is happening in the brain from the start. Even the activation of the root chakra and tingling of the left foot is also occurring in the brain. So the brain is a hologram of the body, and the body is represented holographically in the brain. The brain and the body are not two. Whatever's going on in the body is simultaneously being represented in the brain. And she wants to really reiterate that it's happening both places simultaneously. Kundalini moves hyperbolically through the cosmic cycles of sun and moon, round and around, up and down and up, and basically all over the chakra map. For example, in childhood sexual development, there probably has been some certain level of development in the prefrontal lobes before the genitals become energetically activated. The higher informs the lower. So say you want to work on opening your sexual center, well, you don't do this directly. You work the solar plexus and the heart love center. And then if you want to evolve sex further, then you work the throat, which represents honesty, the third eye for psychic, and the crown for integrated wholeness. And similarly, she says if you want to open the crown, you need to also work on freeing the pelvis to be able to generate that higher energy. There are fundamentals, and the penultimate and the penultimate, but it's basically just one flow of energy. She's saying, like, there's basics, and then there's like the woo, but it all is just one energy at different phases, right? So kink the hose at any point and you interrupt the flow to all the parts. Relax into the flow and you know far more than if you try to put your experience into a neat, logical map. We cannot divide and distinguish the difference in body, mind, subtle, and causal effects because they are part of the same thing. I feel like my camera's crooked, sorry. I'm on the bed, so it's a little weird. There are physical autonomic body reactions such as panic states, grounding, heart expansions, heat, tingles, etc. And then there are the subjective experiences like illumination or devotion, insight, telepathy, precognition, visions, profound dreams, eureka moments, etc. There are lower periods, say during die-off, where cacophonous voices may occur without much higher level, in which these voices have something profoundly illuminating to say. And you can easily know the difference from the tangible power and presence contained within the inner communication. Kundalini flows in different episodes. Sometimes panic will force exercise and breathing. Sometimes bliss and grounding will force lying down. If we understand the chemistries at play and the various autonomic, sympathetic, parasympathetic responses, then we aren't confused or resistant or fearful about what's happening. And that's the joy and liberation that comes from knowing the biology, because then it actually just makes sense, right? With an informed perspective, we know beforehand that if we are going down, we are going to go up. And if we are going up, we are going to go down. It's just the way it works. So knowledge breeds humility and awe and guards against inflation. We know how to work with the on-off switches and the ups and downs, to not suppress either one, but to deepen into the energy of each in a conscious embrace of whatever is happening now. The perspective of whole seeing and farsight. The key to mastery of Kundalini is that when the bliss is acute, it is imperative to draw energy up the spine, or otherwise we find ourselves trying to run from it and push it away. So here it is. We feel it really strongly. It's pointed, right? So she's saying that's when we want to breathe it up. I say, like, spread it out over your body like butter. Like, take that intense energy and move it all around. And in yoga, like, take that balance to every part of the body. Take that pressure that you're placing on the floor and put it in every part of your extremities, right? And spread it out. If we wimp out and try to resist the bliss and push down the energy rather than embrace it, then this will lead inevitably to inevitable compulsivity, addiction, and regression. An immature default rather than mastery and meta-adaption. The radical amplification of normal sensory and emotional perception and of consciousness itself will inevitably draw us into fixation with whatever part of the hyperbolic curve of experience we might be on at the time. So just like chakras are focused on different states of consciousness, whichever one is like up for us to be balanced or cleansed, whatever, that energy is going to hyper fixate us on it. We're going to see it the most, right? However, there's a vantage point from which whole seeing is made possible. From the mind's eye, we can view the changing phenomena of Kundalini without being carried away by it into those fixations, right? The mind's eye is the connective current between the brain stem and the third eye. We obtain the seat of the mind's eye by the felt sense of pulling energy up the body and into this connection in the head. This is done with deep breathing to keep our experience of Kundalini conscious rather than being seduced by its ecstatic fires into a narcotic sleep, she says. Sometimes it is easy. I'm going to just pause and get some more water. It is easy when we are becoming more and more conscious to sort of slip into the traps of that. And often, some of my spiritual teachers have spoken of that. You hear the sadhus who speak about the siddhis as you're raising Kundalini, or maybe you haven't heard of that, but the story is really like, if this spiritual energy is meant for my awakening, my enlightenment, my at-one-ment with the divine in me and in the whole. But on my journey of awakening with the experience of Kundalini, if I divert it and, as she would say, fixate into one of the many possible currents that could take, fixating into healing energy even. And as someone who's participated in the healing arts for a long time, I have to sometimes check in with myself and ask myself, am I hyper fixating on the healing portion? And that's sort of why I have also dropped deeper into shadow work, because I feel like, it's just as important to accept all the parts, and maybe even more so than trying to fix something, because that's a fixation, saying something is off or wrong. Now, sometimes we do have a trapped emotion. We do have like a ball of energy that didn't move because of suppression, because of we didn't know how to deal with it at that time. So we do kind of dance around it. And so in Kundalini activity, it goes to those places and helps massage them out, just like a good massage therapist goes to the knots and finds where they are. And then there is the release, right? So this is where that mind's eye witness attitude becomes so important, because when those things are being released, how easy it is for us to step back and witness and observe the process as observer is going to determine whether we're going to recycle that particular ball of energy, that particular fixation again and again. And again, like almost use it compulsively rather than continuing to expand into acceptance of the full self. So she says, I must also relate the importance of the solar plexus in keeping the balance between the two sides of the nervous system. We can prevent morbid overextension of both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems by conscious breathing into the largest plexus of the body, which is the solar plexus. So let's just take a moment and take awareness here. And the first few times you do this, it will feel tight. It will feel like a contracted space. And even maybe the first time you do it, every time you do it, because we get into this holding pattern sometimes. So breathing into that helps balance, she's saying sympathetic and parasympathetic. It's bringing us to a control center, to a knowledge of both sides at once through the largest plexus of nerves, right? There's the most nerve endings coming from here, branching out. So consciousness there with deep breath sends balanced Kundalini or life force. If we find ourselves in either a high or low slump, a high or a slump, then long walks while focusing on the solar plexus breathing will help to integrate and balance the energies. This continues to be important for years after an awakening as an aid to integration and establishment of the spiritual will. Without integration, we may go through an entire ordeal of an awakening for no benefit to ourselves or others and actually be worse off than we were before. The solar plexus responds instantaneously to the brain. Every minute contraction and expansion of the solar center of life is in obedience with the brain. The solar plexus lies behind the pit of the stomach. It may be energized by practicing the drawing in of the abdominal muscles, so pulling them all the way in, squeezing them out, right? Inward and upward several times, okay? So when we do that, we are massaging that brain-gut connection, okay? And we are also energizing it, that solar conscious part of ourself. The closest parallel in normal human experience to mystic ecstasy of Kundalini activation is the sex sensations. One could look at the spiral of the growth in consciousness in terms of sex energy and its use and see the pathological, conservative, post-conservative, and enlightened uses of sex energy. So there's all of those, from the pathological to the very conservative, which we see a lot religiously speaking, post-conservative, just starting to get out of that, and then also enlightened or more tantric approach. That not all tantra today is practiced in a very enlightened way, so people are taking it back to the pathological a little bit. The body is a template of our conscious, proactive love self-expansion versus our unconscious, reactive fear, narcissist contraction. Oh, I love that line so much. The body is a template of our conscious, proactive love self-expansion. Okay, you could even say that's the sympathetic, that's the yang energy. And the unconscious, reactive fear, narcissist contraction that you can see is the yin state, or the parasympathetic, okay? So it's so interesting because we put so many labels on people acting out parts of these, you know, people being either very conscious, or we say very unconscious, or we say proactive, or we say reactive, or we say they're narcissistic, or they're very loving, right? But those are actually, they're both. It's just where are they one and where are they the other? No one is just one part. Now, one might be hyperinflated for various reasons. Let's just pause and talk about that for a moment. What are the reasons why we might experience a hyperinflation of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic responses? One can be a trauma. Okay, there can be a trauma effect that contracts one side and hyperextends the other. The trauma generally happens around the parasympathetic responses because it's things like going into the subconscious, going into the darkness, going into a contractive state, or a reactive state. So trauma is going to cause one to shrink in and have to react or go into that response, where kindness and love obviously is an opening response. So if we have gone into extreme parasympathetic contraction response, we will often overcompensate for that energetic block by trying to push into the light side, the open, expansive, conscious self. So we're negating that side. And then sometimes that happens in a relationship too, where one person is hyper one way or the other. Okay, it could be hyper one way or the other. I've seen the other, that you're very much exposed to expansive, loving energy and none of the contracted state growing up, and then you hyperinflate into the other to regulate, to experience that, to like try to find that energetic balance that's so necessary for higher life force energy to come through. Okay, so looking at the body, we can see where we are in our relationship to the self and our relationship to the world, because our body doesn't lie. A Kundalini awakening is fundamentally a cellular, atomic, and quantum process. And we interpret our awakening through whatever subjective worldview and story that we've got going. So whether our theosophy relies on deities, gurus, nature, emptiness, or whatever, it really doesn't matter, for our conceptual worldview is secondary, actually, to the chemistry of awakening itself. So she's saying it doesn't really matter what your beliefs are, the awakening will happen for you in the terms and conceptions that you understand. But it doesn't bypass anyone, and the story we tell ourselves is secondary to the chemistry. So the chemistry just is, it just biologically is happening. The story you tell yourself about it, that's your own biz. It is popular to class the realization of emptiness as being the highest on the spiritual totem pole, and in some ways it is, she says. But it is also the meta-adaptation to metamorphosis itself, and the realization action in the world that are the measures of success and spiritual attainment. So she's saying even if emptiness is the highest possibility, it's actually just the way you're able to adapt, like how quickly you can adapt and be resilient, and the success you have in bringing your realization and your metamorphosis into real life. Like how successful are you at bringing that whole process with you into the world and being that with and for all of the things that are part of the world, right? How can you bring that and integrate that in your job, integrate that in your relationships, integrate that in your day-to-day, and not be only hyper attentive to that emptiness, right? Because then you have detached from this world. You're actually no longer in this world. So Emptiness could be the highest state if you're also completely integrated as much as possible and you're able to bring that still mind to every situation and transform it. That's the metamorphic power of being present in your awakening. It's nature that gives you the energy, the resources, and the will to handle the awesome powers of nature. Our current cultural memes and urban environments do not supply the needs of nature. So nature is supplying your nervous system. Nature is supplying your nerves. Nature is supplying the biology and the chemistry. So when I turn this off, I'm going to go walk out into the sunshine for a minute and realize and remember that too, that it's important, because our urban environments don't support us in the awakening journey. The bridge between now and the noble future is none other than the mysterious journey of our own personal evolution. However, if we do not postulate such a perfected future, we have neither the heart nor the vision to transcend the quagmire of complications born from the rationality that has been hijacked by the egocentric survival circuit. If we continue to use our rationality in such an unilluminated, entropic, and disconnected fashion, it is obvious that the geometric growth of the nuclear hydrocarbon civilization means doom for the planet. Woo! That is quite a statement. We can't even evolve our carbon-based structures, what she's saying. Thus, our science and our morality and sensibility must become increasingly subtle, syntropic, and deeper. And it becomes obvious that the journey toward a visionary civilization requires even greater visionary Gnostic abilities, practice, and applied action. The path is that of the subtle unraveling of the mind of God. The gap between here and there can only be bridged by a spiritual development that ensouls body and mind, such that we become a new humanity. As we walk the supernal territory and creative solutions to real problems, sorry, I blended that sentence. As we walk the supernal territory, this new territory, the creative solutions to real problems will naturally arise. But if we remain wholly indoctrinated, okay, and entrained by the existing culture, we will fail to walk the supernal path. Asleep we remain just as a cog in the present status quo, which is largely destructive to self and planet. We assume that the capacities of soul by which we receive the mind of God is largely a function of the refinement and focusing of consciousness in the prefrontal lobes. It is through a distinct initiation to this neurosomatic hardware that a narcissistic self-survival primate is turned into a world-centric visionary co-creator. But I love how she says it's turned into, because it is an evolutionary process to accept all the parts and integrate. First, we identify these parts that may be narcissistic, may be self-apologetic, in the extremes. And as we say, okay, these are parts of me I'm going to love about myself, I'm going to integrate, I'm going to bring more life force to them, which is love. And I'm going to take both parasympathetic and sympathetic responses, and I'm going to bring those into as much harmony as I can when I feel that I'm going to be responsible to bring it back to center. I have the reaction that I need to feel the emotion, and I bring it back to center. And I bring it back to love. And I go back off this way and I bring it back to love. And that way, these tendencies, then we get compassion for everyone. When we can do that, we gain compassion. That's what makes us a visionary leader, is compassion, is feeling all the feelings that everyone else feels and showing what to do with those feelings, how to bring them to a different way of living together. through a distinct initiation of this neurosomatic hardware. Initiation of this neurosomatic hardware, we got to be introduced to more of the prefrontal lobe, more parts of the brain by taking attention in there, becoming aware of it, by becoming aware of your brain, just taking consciousness to, as if you were going to walk inside there in hallways and flip on buttons, bring awareness that the narcissistic self-survival primate that's only functioning from the amygdala and lower brain is turned into a world-centric visionary co-creator, because now we're aware of the whole wide world of our brain. And since we're holographic, now we're aware of the whole wide world of the people. We must first grow tired of life lived in the peripheral development of our shaky self-image created by this culture. We must become desperately lonely for our soul. In becoming conscious of how we have denied our soul to survive in this culture, we can then come home to ourselves and our true function in the whole. Spiritual initiation beyond the threshold involves a literal death and resurrection of the neophyte, or the descent into hell imminence, followed by the ascension into heaven transfiguration. So this is a spiritual initiation. It's happening to you on a spiritual level, and it feels real. And so it's all happening except for your body remains here, and it may go through weird metamorphosis too, but spiritually you go through an actual death process and a resurrection process, and that ain't fun. Sometimes it's compared to, the feeling of reliving past life deaths, like actual physical deaths of being like buried alive or burned alive or terrible things happening, like having your consciousness sort of brush through those old libraries of self as the deconstruction is happening. And you're standing witness to your own demise and resurrection. And becoming conscious of how we have denied our souls to survive in this culture, we can then come home to ourselves and our true function as a whole. With this initiation, there's a dying off of the old self as the prior conditioned reality and its associated defense structures is ruptured, revealing vast, infinite reaches of consciousness beyond. Like, wow, there was so much more to this than I knew. So we're to the next section, which is the shock of awakening. And I guess we'll just do that one tomorrow. So thank you so much. And again, lulu.com if you want to follow along. If these are helping you out, please hit like. If you haven't already, subscribe. And if you know someone who would like or would benefit from listening or being a part of this discussion or anything else that's available on this page, please go ahead and share. And thank you so much for being here with me again. And we'll see you next time.